How's it going, everyone? Some data from a couple years ago has popped up in the news again, looking at a growing political divide between young men and young women, with young women drifting more to the left and young men drifting more to the right. And we're going to take a look at this data, and what we're going to see is that it could actually be explained by something that is not directly in the data, which is a trend of a dropping fertility rate and people tending to have children later in life. Although the data isn't directly about that, we see signs of that in this data if we dig a little deeper, and that's what I'll show you. So let's get into it. This is from the Financial Times. A wide ideology gap is opening up between young men and women in countries across the world. So what these graphs show is political ideology of those 18 to 29-year-olds, where it's separated by sex, and for each sex you have the percent of them who are liberal minus the percent of them who are conservative. So for example, if we look at the blue curve here for young men in South Korea, if we look at, say, 2015 right here, the number we see is about 15%. So what is that? If you take the percent of men who are liberal and subtract the percent of men who are conservative, you get 15%. So the lower a curve is, the more right-wing that sex tends to be, and the higher a curve is, the more left-wing that sex tends to be. So what do we see? Well, for South Korea, just after 2015, we start to see a growing divide with women shifting upward, which means left-wing or liberal, and men shifting downward, meaning right-wing or conservative. For the United States, we see the divide happen around 2005, just before 2010, right? Women shifting liberal, men shifting conservative. For Germany, we see the divide around 2010. Again, women liberal, men conservative. And for the UK, where we see around shortly before 2010, or actually kind of at 2010, we see men actually do move a little bit liberal, but barely. Men kind of remain constant, whereas women move much more liberal than the men do. So in the UK as well, this wide gap opens up between men and women, specifically young men, young women, where the young women tend to be far more left-wing than the men, who tend to be far more right-wing than the women, even though they may still be left of center. Now, here's the thing with this data. When you look at this zero mark, if a data point is touching zero, it means that the percent of that sex who are liberal is equal to the percent of that sex who are conservative. Here's the problem with this zero line. What is considered centrist is different from year to year. Okay, what was considered centrist in 2005 is different than what was considered centrist in 2010, is different than what's centrist in 2015 or in 2020. When we look at the US data, it starts at 1990. Okay, centrists of 1990 and the centrists of 2020 are completely different people. Okay, they have completely different views. Look at the Germany data, 1980 versus 2020. Okay, and the UK data is like the US, 1990 versus 2020. Okay, what is centrist changes over time. What is considered right-wing or left-wing changes over time. So what this zero mark means, it means different things depending on which point along the x-axis you're looking at. Okay, so for example, if we look at South Korea, we see this big downward trend for the men. Does that mean that the men got a lot more right-wing? Or does it mean that what was considered centrist shifted a lot to the left and men kind of kept their views the same, so as a result men's views would be marked as more right-wing, but the men's views didn't really change much? Okay, or maybe it's a combination of the above. Same goes with the other countries. Or for example, look at the UK data. It shows that both men and women have shifted sharply to the left, just women much more so than men. Now, did men and women actually change their views that drastically, or did the centrist views actually shift a lot to the right? And that's why it looks like young men and young women are more left-wing than they were before, but actually their views didn't change that much as the graph would suggest. We don't know that. But what we can tell is that there certainly is a growing divide politically between young men and young women, with young women being more liberal and young men being more conservative. And this divide started around 2010 in the UK, Germany, and United States, and around 2015 in South Korea. So then the question becomes, why? Why is there this growing divide? Well, to answer that, we look at some exit polls from the recent New York City mayoral elections. So here we have the exit polls by age and gender. The left-wing candidate was Mamdani in blue, and the more centrist, center-left candidate was Cuomo in gray, and it was between these two that the competition was mostly happening. Sliwa in red was the right-wing Republican candidate. So, easy way to look at this graph with, a number of candidates here is just the light blue Mamdani is the left-wing self-described socialist candidate, and not light blue is everyone else, the not socialist vote. So, when you look at men here, you see that as the men get older, their support for Mamdani drops. Their support for the left wing drops. And you see the same thing for women. As women get older, their support for the left wing drops. Now that itself is not surprising. Younger people tend to lean more left compared to older people who tend to lean more right. That may be because for younger people, it's more natural to trust that an authority figure can provide for them, because that's what parents do, and younger people are closer to that age of depending on their parents. For people who are older adults, it's more natural for them to understand that they can provide for themselves, and more natural for them to not really trust some other authority figure to provide for them. So that trend itself, nothing surprising there. But look what happens when we look at young men and young women. Big difference. Men 18 to 29, 65% voted for the left-wing candidate. Keep in mind that New York is a pretty left-leaning city. That's why you see these, the numbers tend to be more left-wing, and Mamdani, the left-wing candidate, did win. Okay, so for men 18 to 29, it's 65%. For men 30 to 44, it's also 65%. No change between men 18 to 29 and men 30 to 44. For women, huge change. Okay, women 18 to 29, 82% supported the left-wing candidate versus 64% of women 30 to 44. When you look at every age group other than 18 to 29, there's practically no difference between men and women. 30 to 44, men 65, women 64% support the left wing. 45 to 64, men 43%, women 41%. Pretty much no difference. 65 plus, men 34%, women 34%. No difference. The only difference we see here between men and women is the 18 to 29 category, where the men are voting the same as those who are just older than them, 30 to 44, whereas the women are voting very, very different, 82% supporting the left-wing candidate. So young women are acting very different from young men, and they're acting very different from the women just one age group older than them. Okay, for every other age group, no difference between men and women. So it's not a difference of young men and young women exactly. It's more so a difference of young women and everybody else. So what is going on? And what is going on may be shown by a different chart from these same exit polls. Here we have the data asking whether people have children or not. Okay, about parents. So look, men with children, 47% voted left wing. Men with no children, 48% voted left wing. Basically no difference. Women with children, 44% voted left wing. Women with no children, 55% voted left-wing. So that's a big difference, 44% to 55%. For men, it looks like having children or not doesn't really make a difference in how they vote. For women, it looks like it makes a big difference. Women with children are actually more right-wing, whereas women with no children tend to be more left-wing. Look at the votes for Cuomo, who is the centrist or moderate left-wing candidate, really the more right-wing of the two mainstream candidates in this race. The only category for which Cuomo won a majority was women with children. There's this stereotype that women tend to be more left-wing than men and men tend to be more right-wing than women. Well, it doesn't really look like that because women with children are the most right-wing demographic when you're comparing men and women with or without children. Now, the way time works, younger people tend to have less children than older people because having children takes time. Okay? So when you're looking at a younger demographic, like 18 to 29-year-olds, well, you are looking at a group of people where those without children are overrepresented. And for men, with or without children, doesn't really make a difference in terms of how they vote, it looks like, if we go by the New York mayoral election exit polls. Whereas for women, being with or without children makes a big difference in terms of how women vote. So consider a situation where you have a group of young people. Notice the data points are all mostly above the zero line, right? So they all tend to lean left. And the age at which people tend to start having children starts increasing. So among those young people, you have more childless people. Well, for the men, that is not going to make much of a difference. But for the women, it will make a difference, and you will see more of a portion of that young female population being left-wing because a larger portion of them are childless because people tend to have children later on. And what are you going to see as a result? You're going to see a political divide between young men and young women because the portion of those young women who are childless is greater because people tend to have children later. So if we are seeing a drop in fertility rate, then you will expect to see such a political divide. And that's exactly what we see. Look at this chart here. Births per woman on average, right? That's fertility rate over time. This is in the United States. Now, remember, the United States data starts just before 1990. What's going on around 1990? Well, the data is pretty flat. The fertility rate is pretty much the same. And when does the fertility rate start dropping? Around 2010. That's when you see this drop occur. And what do we see in this data? Around 2010, that's when the divide happens. Now, this data here is just for the United States, just like this data here is just for the New York mayoral election, but because we see a similar trend for different countries in this data here, if we assume that similar processes culturally are going on in other countries as in the United States, well, look at that. Fertility rate starts to drop in 2010, and the political divide between young men and young women starts to increase in 2010. And what could be causing that political divide? Well, if you have a dropping fertility rate, you're going to have more young people without children. And for men, as we see, that doesn't really make a difference voting-wise. Do they have children or not? But for women, it makes a big difference, with women without children tending to lean more left, which means you have more left-wing voters among those young women, which means a growing political divide between young men and young women. So the data we are looking at right here may very well be something that's just a result of people having children later in life and a lower fertility rate overall in these countries. So, I hope you enjoyed that, provide some insight, maybe it's thought-provoking, and until next time.